Sonic has had a very entertaining transition to 3D. You see, I'm original. Unlike his counterparts where things may have run a little more smoothly, Sonic has tried a million things during his time in the third dimension, and honestly, as up and down as the franchise has been, it's always made Sonic an interesting character to follow. When it comes to how I got into this franchise, the adventure era games are where I got my start. And let's just say upon playing those first minutes of Sonic Heroes, I was definitely hooked on his high-speed adventures. These games were basically my foray into the world of platformers and shaped my taste in games for years to come. Good or bad, these games have had a huge presence in my childhood, and I think it's about time to take a deeper dive into them and truly figure out just how I feel about these games. Sonic Heroes has players race a team of 3 characters they can switch between who each have unique abilities to overcome obstacles designed to take full advantage of them. Development was led by producer Yuji Naka and director/lead designer Takashi Iizuka and lasted about 20 months. Iizuka didn't want to make a sequel to Sonic Adventure 2 as he worried it would only appeal to Sonic fans. Interested in return to gameplay similar to the Genesis games, Sonic team decided to design Sonic Heroes so casual players not familiar with Sonic could easily get into it. I will say from first-hand experience this totally worked. But at the same time, there's a lot about this game that's the complete opposite of casual, but we'll get into that. Sonic Heroes was also the first multi-platform Sonic game to be released on the GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox, so it was basically fated to bring new players into the franchise. Despite all these positive factors, reviewers were mixed on the game. They praised the game's focus on fast gameplay and noted its similarities to the series' original 2D entries, a choice that some considered an improvement from the Sonic Adventure games. Critics, however, slammed the game for not addressing the problems of previous series games such as poor camera, controls, and voice acting.
You mean the bad guy?
Despite the mixed reception, the game was commercially successful with 3.41 million copies sold by 2007. Not too shabby. Sonic Heroes is such an important game to my journey with video games. I did own a PS4 beforehand and played a handful of games on that console, but between Scooby-Doo, Cyber Chase, and Bugs Bunny Lost in Time, they were games I liked, but didn't obsess over. So when my dad got my brother and I a brand new Xbox, he was logical enough to realize we needed games for it too. So he got my brother some random Need for Speed game, and I got Sonic Heroes. I played it, and then I just kept playing it and playing it. I had so many firsts with this game. It's one of the only games I probably 100%ed over 50 times. It was a game that gave me so much to talk about that I joined message boards and basically began my online presence as RidersDX. It's safe to say that Sonic Heroes is not only my favorite Sonic game, but also my favorite game of all time. Until recently. I guess when you get older, your taste can change a bit, and you are also not as blinded by the nostalgic overflow of rainbows that can cloud your mind when it comes to childhood loves. In recent years, when I would pick up Sonic Heroes, the voices of internet mainstays would cloud my judgment, along with further playthroughs that would expose me to more of its imperfections. Sonic Heroes was this weird mix of old and new ideas. It almost feels like a soft reboot the way Sonic Adventure was. From the implementation of the team mechanics to the overall style and story structure of the game, it shared way more differences than similarities to the adventure games. I suppose it's a somewhat natural evolution though. The adventure games toyed with multiple playable characters, but by giving each of them their own set of mechanics and levels. Sonic Heroes, however, approaches it differently by having all 3 characters playable simultaneously that can be switched between through the press of a button. I always felt this worked really well here. It feels seamless once you get used to the game when switching between Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles. In fact, it feels like you're playing one character at times that just needs to switch between the vast arsenal of abilities. But at the same time, it gives fans the satisfaction of playing as all their favorite characters. But as many critics will point out, it isn't a perfect game, but not so much because of the actual team mechanics, but more so because of issues that plague the adventure titles. A camera that gets in your way, slippery controls, lots of bottomless pits, especially in later levels. Heroes not only maintain these issues, but it actually made them worse. I'm quite proud. As fun as Heroes is to me, it always takes a little bit for me to get reacquainted with its controls when I play it again after a long absence. It's just not an intuitive game for most people, especially people new to the franchise. But once I sort through that initial awkwardness, muscle memory takes over and I have a very seamless gameplay experience. But I acknowledge that I've gotten so used to how Heroes feels and plays that I'm able to play it in a way where I can avoid most of its issues. For instance, I may know the camera gets wonky in this area, so I'll just avoid it as best I can. Or this path is very thin that might not be a good idea to traverse it with Sonic versus Tails and Knuckles. I guess the question comes in though as to what can you criticize as bad game design compared to simply saying that a player has to, for lack of a better term, get good. Everyone has a different opinion on that when it comes to Heroes, but I will say accessibility is something that's been key to the success of lots of critically acclaimed platformers. Mario Odyssey, for instance, that's a relatively easy game for people to just pick up and play, but the more time you spend with it, the crazier the jumps and skips you can perform along with the whole arsenal of hats. Heroes doesn't really have that in my eyes. I mean, it tried to do that with team roles, but like, what 6-year-old in their right mind would pick a team with a frog-obsessed cat first over the main characters on the box art? Certainly not me. Despite all its flaws though, I can still go back to Heroes and transport myself back to those innocent days and just have fun with a solid platformer. And the game in my eyes has aged well in many ways. For instance, Heroes to me has some of the strongest visual aesthetics of any 3D Sonic game. There's a reason why we constantly see levels like Seaside Hill and Casino Park return in spin-off titles. All these levels have such bright and contrasting colors, but not in a way that's overwhelming compared to a lot of games coming out nowadays. It just hits a perfect balance to me that really captures the essence of the classic games. All the environments are extremely diverse as well. A futuristic city, a vast canyon, a haunted castle, and the biggest armada of fleets I think Eggman will ever create. To this day, it's just such a visually stunning game. You have to give the game that. The music is, as usual, top-notch as well. While it isn't as cohesive as Sonic Adventure 2's, the diversity suits the variety nature of the level themes here. Grand Metropolis sports a catchy as hell guitar riff with electronic undertones. Meanwhile, Hang Castle really predicted that lo-fi craze we're seeing today. And Seaside Hill, man, it just really captures the essence of the first level in a Sonic game. I'll never get tired of that melody, and I more than welcome the stupid amount of remixes we've heard for it throughout the years. Heroes has some very solid vocal themes as well. My personal favorite being the theme song itself. I think it's the only game where its theme song is literally the title of the game. That's just iconic. As much as I'll sit here and just spaz out about what makes Heroes so great, admittedly, there are some design choices I cannot praise. One huge thing this game gets a lot of crap for is its special stages. I'm not really sure how I thought these were great as a kid, but going through them now, the characters have 10 times as much slipperiness as they do normally that makes some of the later stages absolutely horrid. Not to mention due to some up geometry physics, you'll just randomly slow down and even stop with no rhyme or reason. I especially realized this after playing the 3DS version of Generations and saw how they took this concept and didn't make it suck. Another thing I'm not as crazy about is the game's story. Admittedly, Sonic Team were very transparent with acknowledging the story took a huge backseat compared to the adventure games and that this was intentional. I just can't help but be disappointed nonetheless because I think you should always try to tell somewhat of an interesting story if it suits the franchise, especially when you have a character presumed dead returning. Team Dark's whole story is literally a giant cliffhanger on why Shadow is back, but I guess we'll get to that later on. But since the story is so minuscule here, it doesn't really impact the game experience, it's just a disappointment is all. By far my biggest critique for the game though is how repetitive it gets if you're going for not even 100% but just trying to get to the final boss. You have 4 teams here, which sounds great on paper. The adventure games had some nice diversity in its gameplay with its different characters, though sometimes it results in a little too much diversity, inserting gameplay styles that probably shouldn't be in a Sonic game. So what Sonic Team decides to do in classic fashion is go to the other extreme end and create nearly identical campaigns for all 4 teams. Each team goes through the same zones and have nearly identical level designs, with some differences to make them just slightly different enough. Team Dark is probably my least favorite team in the game. They basically took Team Sonic's levels and drew in double the enemies and even made them longer in some instances when some of Team Sonic's levels were already approaching long lengths. It just feels the most redundant with them, especially if you're playing them after Team Sonic, which I'm sure many kids did just because of Shadow the Edgelord. Team Rose is less offensive to me, while they still feel very redundant. Since their levels are shorter and easier, it's just not as annoying to me. But then it's like, why did they even have to be here? Why couldn't they have just been an optional easy mode in the game instead of a requirement to reach the final boss? I will admit though, they were the only reason I managed to see Hang Castle and beyond for a long time because, well, as a kid, just seeing the alligator with Team Sonic made me my pants. I kid you not, I brought the Prima guide and everything because I really needed there to be some kind of way to skip this section. I even asked my dad to play through it for me. I'm just so glad I'm not a kid anymore. I was literally paralyzed with fear. The only team I think offers something interesting here is Chaotix. They take the same levels and insert a unique objective within each one through a mission-like structure. Some of these are pretty fun and actually encourage a lot of exploration within the levels. Others, however, last for way too long and just are a chore to go through. They really are just a mixed bag, but I definitely have more fun playing through them compared to the other two. Heroes came out during an era where Sonic Team felt the game had to be a certain length, but after seeing games like Colors and Generations come out in recent years, I much rather would have had a less repetitive experience that fine-tuned the very best versions of these levels. If you have fun with the game, it's not terrible playing through all these levels, it just gets kind of boring by the time you play the third or fourth team in story mode. With all that being said and done, I love Sonic Heroes, not just because it had such a significant impact on my taste in games now, but simply because it's a well-designed adventure that has many high points to it. It may not be perfect and definitely not for everyone, but to me it was a nice spin on the adventure gameplay that looks and plays differently, but still allowed that classic adventure formula to shine in a different context. I'm sure there were many people disappointed this wasn't a continuation of the classic adventure gameplay, but I think once those expectations are let go of, what you have with Heroes is still a fun experience that takes all the best parts of that gameplay and just makes it new. I would absolutely not mind seeing this mechanic return. I highly doubt it ever will, but it's nice to see other titles like Riders and Team Sonic Racing take inspiration from Heroes with their own mechanics, and also seeing the game constantly referenced in other ways. Whether you like it or not, there's no doubt Heroes has had a huge impact on what we see from the franchise today, and rightfully so. It's a great game, and I owe it so much. Sonic Adventure. I mean, what can you really say at this point? It's a 1998 platform video game for Sega's Dreamcast and the first main Sonic game in full-on 3D. The story follows Sonic and friends in their quest to collect the 7 Chaos Emeralds and stop Dr. Robotnik from unleashing chaos, that big blue blob thingy destroying this poor building here. Following the cancellation of the Sega Saturn game Sonic Extreme, Sonic Team began work on Sonic Adventure in 1997, drawing inspiration from locations in Peru and Guatemala. There's like actual pictures of them visiting these locations, it's so cute. Yuji Okawa redesigned the characters for their transition to 3D, which were quite dramatic retrospectively. Sonic Adventure received critical acclaim and became the Dreamcast's bestseller, with 2.5 million copies sold by August 2006. Reviewers lauded the visuals and gameplay, calling it a major technological advancement. Others were frustrated by the camera controls and glitches, and reactions to its audio were mixed. I've only ever experienced this game through Sonic Adventure DX, a port of the original to GameCube and Windows featuring extra features and update graphics, which alone started a war within the community. I vividly remember finding random websites to download the PC demo over and over again, since I guess for some reason it always disappeared on my PC. I guess I wasn't a very responsible kid. 6 stages offering a taste of a grand adventure, especially Sonic and Emerald Coast as he ran from that whale like a total boss. Like, just look at that determination. Eventually I would purchase the game on both the PC and GameCube, was absolutely obsessed with it. I played this game shortly after my introduction to the franchise through Sonic Heroes, and it just offered more of that blazing 3D Sonic action I was quickly craving as a new fan. Sonic has some of the best control here I've ever experienced in a Sonic game. There's just this beautiful balance between precise platforming and high-speed reactions thanks to both his control and the ease of the spin dash. I think this is my favorite spin dash slash accelerator slash boost slash whatever in the 3D Sonic game. The spin dash is so easy to activate, but you really do need to use it at the most optimal times to take full advantage of it. There's no use in just pressing it all the time, for instance, if it just leads you off the path into some other area or bottomless pit. It's kind of a similar effect as to having a boost at your instant disposal, but not nearly as overpowering. But by far, my favorite thing about Sonic's levels here are the level design. Sonic has always been a challenge in terms of balancing linearity and overwhelmingly large maps. Some of the classic and boost games have levels that are way too large, and the level becomes less of a blast through it as fast as you can and more of a quest to find where the hell it is you're supposed to go, while other games including future adventure ones become way too linear and don't offer enough options for players to truly feel like they have the power to do as much as Sonic, including carving out your own path to the goal. But Sonic Adventure's levels sort of hit this perfect balance on the two extremes. Take Emerald Coast for instance. In this section you can take the very frequently treaded path with the springs up to the top of the mountain, or you could get creative and literally spin dash up the mountain to the top, if you can actually pull it off. This is just one example of some of the incredible secrets inserted into the levels of this game. The best part is it never feels outright overwhelming. Like, I still feel I have full control of Sonic, and that my experience is not hammered by an excessive assortment of choices to make. There are some things about Sonic's control that haven't aged as well. The camera can often get in the way here, especially during boss fights in tight spaces where if you hit a certain invisible wall, it takes your focus completely off the boss and leaves you vulnerable to attack. Yes, I'm looking at you, Chaos 4. In fact, that's kind of where the game's weak points are the most obvious. Tighter spaces where Sonic's control just isn't that fluid. Skydeck is probably the worst offender of this. Those tight ass pathways are just so easy to get stuck in. In fact, that whole level is terrible to be honest. But then you have levels like Emerald Coast, Twinkle Park, and Speed Highway where the areas are more traversable as Sonic and are filled to the brim with secrets and shortcuts to discover. I believe Sonic Adventure is the one that takes its most inspiration from the classics, which makes all too much sense. Combining everything together just crafted this experience that was a perfect melding between the classic gameplay and brand new ideas the team had for a 3D space. And honestly, I have just as much fun scurrying around Station Square as I do soaring through Windy Valley. It really is the mark of a great game if you can have fun just f***ing around. Not just a great game, but a great foundation for games going forward. Now let's talk about the rest of the game. One of the most significant features of an adventure game is the option to play multiple characters in their own campaigns. This concept ultimately took full form for the first time in the original adventure with 5 other playable characters. I'm sure as a kid we all thought, oh wow, more awesome characters to play as, they must be just as fun as Sonic, when in reality it was more of a mystery bag kind of thing. Of course you gotta have Tails here, and he has a gameplay style that's very much molded after Sonic's. Tails retains a lot of his abilities from the classic games but in a 3D space. His abilities feel so much more powerful and effective. Yes, Tails is able to fly in this game, but not only can he fly far and fast. Tails has an objective to actually race against Sonic in his levels, which sounds like a fun idea, and also a great way to supplement Sonic's gameplay. And you know what? It is. Due to Tails' massive game-breaking flying ability, you can pull off some pretty epic shortcuts with him, which arguably makes him faster than Sonic in all honesty. This is much more apparent in his more wide open levels like Windy Valley and Speed Highway. I mean, it's absolutely insane how fast you can finish some of these levels. And therein lies the pro and the con. You see, playing Tails is a lot of fun for me because of how overpowered his flying is, but because of how easy it makes his levels, they mostly take like a minute to complete and really don't leave a lasting impact on you compared to Sonic. It's basically an easy mode of 5 of Sonic's levels, and while it plays well, it doesn't last nearly long enough to be satisfying. That's where most of the criticism for Tails ultimately comes from, and I do agree with it, but it doesn't change the fact that the mechanic itself works and is fun, and I think it's a perfect alternative gameplay style to have here. If they could take Tails' gameplay and just make a whole open world like game out of it, it could be such a treat. Knuckles also makes a smashing appearance here, and he's in my opinion the most well implemented character here besides Sonic. He also retains all of his abilities from the classic games. His gliding, climbing, and punches work perfectly well here and makes him a blast to travel wide open environments with. He was also given a digging ability which fits him to a T. The difference between him and Tails though is that Knuckles is given a completely different mission objective that's more suited to his abilities. Knuckles' levels here were the first instance of the treasure hunting style, where the goal is to scope around an open space to find 3 pieces of the Master Emerald. I like how they approached Knuckles' gameplay a lot more than Tails because it gave him a more unique gameplay experience that still fit in line with the main Sonic gameplay due to his moveset and control, but at the same time they didn't just try shoving Knuckles into Sonic's levels, which probably would have resulted in a situation similar to Tails. I will say Knuckles' levels are a little too small in this game to make the treasure hunting worthwhile, but it's still a good amount of fun using his abilities to travel to areas you simply wouldn't be able to access as Sonic. Then we have Amy Rose. Wonder what awesome way they adapted her that makes her just as fun as Tails and Knuckles. Well, we basically got a second-rate Mario clone. Amy's probably the most basic character in the game. She moves at a speed far slower than the previous 3 and also doesn't have any very useful attacks except a hammer with a very short range. She does have a bit of a unique twist on her levels where she's being chased by this robot named Zero, but honestly once you realize you can hit the stupid robot whenever it's about to attack, it's pretty easy to just go about your way without paying much attention to it. She only has 3 levels so she doesn't overstay a welcome, but I just feel like her development could have gone towards other things like maybe more Sonic levels. And speaking of wasted resources, we also have Big the Cat. I've heard that the reason Big was implemented in this game was because Sega wanted a fishing simulator on a Dreamcast and thought pairing it with Sonic would make it sell, and thus Big the Cat was born. Yes, the objective of Big's levels is to fish out his best friend, a green frog with a mutated tail. The fishing mechanic itself is going to take a little time to figure out for new players, especially since there's practically no instructions on it beyond a tutorial you can easily miss in the main menu. But once you do, each level doesn't take any longer than a minute in my eyes, as fishing for Froggy is the same exact process each time. I mean, it's a fine mechanic in terms of its design, but definitely doesn't belong anywhere in a Sonic game and is an even bigger waste of time than Amy. But at least we have this. The last character is Eggman's creation, E102 Gamma, and probably the most conflicting gameplay style for me. If you read the description of Gamma's gameplay from afar, which is basically a third-person targeted shooter/platformer, it doesn't seem to suit a Sonic game. And you know what? It really doesn't. It's the most oddball gameplay style here besides fishing. Pretty much little to no elements of Sonic gameplay besides, well, jumping and stuff. But despite that, the gameplay style itself is pretty well done. Lockout mechanics work well, and there's something oddly satisfying about linking multiple targets together and earning a massive amount of time being added to your clock. Gamma's levels are played with a time limit, but destroying enemies adds on to that time. The more enemies you lock onto and destroy simultaneously, the bigger the time bonus you get. But I guess just because it plays well and I enjoy it, doesn't necessarily mean it belongs in a Sonic game. You could say if Crash was another playable character here that he has good gameplay, but again, doesn't belong in a Sonic game. I'm really glad Gamma is here though, especially with his role in the story, which I'll touch upon in a bit. But again, I really wish time spent developing his gameplay was spent towards solidifying the main campaign. In fact, I think this game could have been a real treat if it just focused on the main trio, as in my eyes, they have the best and most Sonic-like gameplay here, and I especially think Tails and Knuckles could have had their levels more fleshed out to suit their unique characteristics. I wouldn't have minded Amy, Big, and Gamma as perhaps side missions or little diversions from the main gameplay, but they certainly didn't need their own campaigns in my eyes. But the good thing about them having their own gameplay is the fact that we have a story mode where we could explore the perspectives of 6 different points of view. Amy and Gamma, for instance, have an extremely strong interaction here that results in Gamma truly questioning questioning all the ways taught by his master. In fact, Gamma's story is probably the best part of this game narrative-wise. He basically turns from loyal Eggman servant to a robot who cares about the well-being of others, which leads to probably one of the most heartbreaking moments ever shown in a Sonic series. I also enjoyed that we got to explore more Knuckles' origins since the story was tied so heavily to the Echidnas and their extinction. I wish Knuckles was a little more involved with the plot actually, like it just would have been nice to learn more details about his own upbringing and such, but maybe I just have to finally buy some of the comics to get that kind of detail. I think Sonic Adventure has a story that sure has aged in a lot of ways, but still established a formulaic approach to adventures that Sonic games used for the longest time. But the difference between adventure and games that follow is that they made it a point to make sure a good amount of characters had grown from beginning to end. Tails is probably my favorite example in the game, as we see a little boy who goes from fighting at the side of his hero to taking on challenges on his own and truly breaking out of his own shell. I felt like a proud dad when I played through Tails' story for the first time and saw the crowd cheering for Tails as he finally took out Eggman, as weird as it looked and sounded.
You saved the day! You're the best!
Though he's a bit of a bitch now, Tails is truly the GOAT of the adventure games characterization wise. I know the story gets cheesy and outright obvious with its messages, but I guess nostalgia still blinds me from those vibes, and I just enjoyed the journey this game took me on so much that intertwined the gameplay narrative so effortlessly. And I didn't even get into all the extra things this game provides. The Child Guard, for instance, is one of the most universally loved side modes to ever appear in a Sonic game, and no one really understands why Sega hasn't tried to do like a child mobile game or something that's filled to the brim of microtransactions. Like it'd literally be free money. The game is tied together by a great atmosphere that feels like a perfect blend of the classic games and a modern, more urban aesthetic the adventure games became known for. Not to mention an iconic and diverse soundtrack that gave us some of Junson Yu's earliest classics. I can't wait for the day I get to see Crush 40 live and scream "Open Your Heart" at the top of my lungs, or the day the club gets some actual decent taste in music and lets me do the robot to Gamma's theme. I'll admit, I've been a bit up and down in terms of my opinion of this game, especially with more recent reception questioning how the game's aged. In fact, I made this video on why I didn't love Adventure, but you know what? I'm gonna change my mind again because that's my right as a wishy-washy human. Sonic Adventure is a wonderful experience and I'm so glad to become such a beloved and iconic game in the franchise. So here's to hoping we see more adventures as grand as this one in the future. The infamous Shadow the Hedgehog. The game follows his attempts to learn about his past due to his suffering from amnesia. This leads him down numerous interactions ranging from multiple Sonic characters to this really gross looking eye. And just to make things more confusing for the poor guy, Shadow the Hedgehog also introduces third-person shooter elements and non-linear gameplay to the Sonic franchise. Sonic Team wanted to make a game featuring Shadow to capitalize on his popularity and resolve plot mysteries that began all the way back in Sonic Adventure 2 and were basically elongated in Sonic Heroes. Iizuka strove to attract an older audience with Shadow the Hedgehog being the first game in the series to receive an E10+ rating. But as you all probably know, Shadow the Hedgehog received unfavorable reviews from critics, who criticized its controls, mature themes, level design, and addition of guns and other weapons to traditional Sonic gameplay. Despite negative reviews, the game was commercially successful, selling 2.06 million copies by March 2007. It's kinda hard to believe that many people were actually enticed by this concept. Now, as much fun as I may like to poke at this game's existence, I will give credit where it's due. Being a third-person shooter allowed for the game to retain a lot of classic Sonic elements actually, while implementing a very polarized mechanic that actually feels seamless. Your shooting is automatically targeted at enemies when you're close enough for most weapons, so there's little need to aim in this game. It allows you to continue traveling at high speeds just with the addition of some fast-paced combat. And you know, it actually in my eyes is one of the most well-designed parts of the game. I think maybe if you replace the realistic guns with perhaps something a little bit more appropriate for the Sonic franchise, this really wouldn't be as jarring as it still looks to this day. Despite the game getting one of the things people pretty much assume would be a hot mess right, there's a whole bunch of other stuff where that unfortunately isn't the case. The game sticks very close to the adventure roots compared to Heroes, but it nonetheless sports many differences. Shadow feels slippery to control at many points, similar to how the speed characters felt in Heroes. But to be honest, this didn't actually impact my gameplay that much due to the level design. The stages in Shadow are a lot more open-ended than previous games. The spaces you traverse through are wider and some levels are just flat out playgrounds you need to circle circle around through. I guess I've always been interested in adventure gameplay taking on this style. I mean, it does seem like something that could translate into a more open world like environment somewhat well, but sadly there just isn't a lot of interesting things going on in these levels to warrant that. The classic speed platforming is basically non-existent here, despite Shadow's control retaining a lot of the same elements as the adventure games. I mean, technically if you wanted more of that, you could pretty much speed through most of these levels, but that typically just consists of just running through open spaces, skipping all the enemies until you reach the goal ring. There aren't actually many interesting platforming elements to traverse through, or shortcuts to discover, but there's a very intentional reason behind this change. One of the biggest features of this game touted through its marketing is the ability to actually choose who Shadow decides to side with. Have you always envisioned Shadow fighting side by side with Sonic, carrying out your road's death wish and destroying all humans, or doing some other random crack that makes no sense? Well, whatever it may be, you get to decide. In each level you have multiple objectives, and depending on which one you complete will impact the story. There's typically a hero, dark, and normal mission. When I was a kid waiting for this game to release, I remember actually being intrigued by this concept. It's always a bonus when you're able to give players the option to shape their journeys in significant ways, and Shadow just seemed like this canvas that was easily moldable and depending on where you wanted him to go. A lot of criticism was directed towards this mechanic, however, because it essentially renders everything Shadow could possibly go through in this game as non-canon. Because obviously everything that happens here can't all have happened to Shadow, as all these endings would immediately contradict with each other apart from the final story. But honestly, who gives a f? I think something about the Sonic fanbase I wish we toned down is how much weight we place upon Sonic having a working canon. First off, it ain't gonna happen. Sorry, but Sega has shown repeatedly over and over again that they don't give a damn about continuity beyond a few small gestures and references. Secondly, Shadow the Hedgehog was never supposed to build that solid canon explaining Shadow's journey. From the very beginning, Shadow the Hedgehog was meant to give power to the players to decide what Shadow the Hedgehog they wanted to play as, and that's exactly what it does. Maybe some of the marketing might have led people to believe that I was going to tell a more concrete story about Shadow, but I don't know, that's something that I guess that was more so up to interpretation. But quite honestly, just because none of this stuff is canon doesn't mean there aren't any solid moments of character development here that's genuinely satisfying to witness. Yes, the story of this game is all over the place, but it's not like that wasn't intentional. Overall, I don't think the game has the best writing simply because it writes Shadow into a bunch of situations that retrospectively make no sense for the character. But I'm not gonna lie, it's hilariously entertaining seeing Shadow stand over Sonic touting road domination with the black arms, and that's something only this game could provide, so why not enjoy it? At the same time, there's actually some really good moments here that I'm just gonna assume are canon because they are just that great. My favorite cutscene in this game has to be when the commander and Shadow meet. Shadow learns what happened the night Maria had died and why she was killed, and this causes Shadow to go through a mental cycle where he has to accept that his creation was highly involved with that situation. There's even an ending where Shadow essentially states he should have never been created, and I just really felt for Shadow in this moment. Having to grapple with that guilt is something that's very natural for Shadow to go through, and he even goes through a similar journey in Sonic Battle that offers a better resolution. I made a whole video actually about Shadow's entire character arc you can check out in the top right corner if you like. This is something I wish could get fleshed out in like an animated series or something, as I think there's just mountains of good storytelling that could arise from this, but I'll take this set of cutscenes for now I guess. Overall, the story has its ridiculous moments, but that's just part of the charm of the game. I like being able to mold Shadow's journey in any way I want it. Sure, the actual story progression doesn't make much sense in terms of why Shadow goes from this place to that place, but who cares? It's fun choosing this path, and I thought it was a fun experiment Sonic Team had took on. What really helps supplement this is the overall presentation of the game. The game's colors greatly contrast from Hero's more vibrant aesthetic. The game sports a darker, more industrial look to it, and while it is far from my favorite use of colors in a Sonic game, it completely sets the mood of Shadow and shows a full commitment to the hot mess this game is. I will say though, I do enjoy just looking at Digital Circuit, one of the only more colorful environments of the game. Like, can we please see this track return to a racing game or something? It's just dead gorgeous. The soundtrack, you guessed it, is absolutely awesome. I will say it's not as strong as the previous games, but it takes that electric guitar driven sound from Sonic Adventure 2 and just makes it heavier and darker. Some of my favorite tracks include Lethal Highway, Mad Matrix, and Cosmic Fall, but there's probably way more I could be naming right now. It's not the most diverse soundtrack admittedly, but I think the cohesiveness works well for this game's tone. If this type of music is not your cup of tea though, there's not much else in here for you to enjoy unfortunately. The vocal themes are sort of hit hit or miss for me. They all sport that same heavier metal-like tone, and I just kind of feel exhausted after listening to them all in a row. Crush 40 does the main theme here, and it is a great track and very iconic. All Hail Shadow is also one of my favorites, and I'm so glad it returns in future games. As for the actual mission objectives you have to complete to alter the story, oh boy. Think of the chaotic missions from Heroes and just stretching them to the extremes on both ends of the spectrum. Some missions are completely fine and perfectly balanced with the level's length. I actually really like the ones where you need to destroy something like an aircraft because it's really satisfying to just shoot at them, especially when you get like Chaos Control or Chaos Blast and are granted unlimited ammo. Like, it's real satisfying to just constantly shoot at them. It feels great. But then you have some levels that are actually 10 times worse than the longest levels with the chaotics. The worst example I could think of by far is Mad Matrix, where you need to destroy all the bombs on the circuit for Black Doom. First off, do you see how vast this area is? It's absolutely ridiculous. On top of that, since they're all on the circuit, you can't directly go to a bomb if you see it. You need to pick a direction to go in and just hope it brings you closer to it. There are a few missions like this in terms of length, and they can take a half hour sometimes, especially if you're not familiar with the course. It's absolutely insane, and the backtracking is horrendous. As you may guess, this is why the level design in Shadow is more open-ended. The development team had to make enough space to fit in 3 separate objectives, though the normal one was typically just getting to the gold ring. But each mission will certainly take you through different parts of the level, which I will admit actually adds a good amount of replay value to this game. I'm just really conflicted about Shadow the Hedgehog. There's so many things to rag on about the game, and I didn't even get into why Black Doom is not an enticing antagonist, but I really enjoyed my time with the game. Like Heroes, it was a game I played when I was just getting into the franchise and I was hyped for it. Actually, it was the first Sonic game I think I brought during release week, so I was able to anticipate the game, follow up on its news, get the press over its reviews, the whole experience. But I've never called the game great or even good. Even as a kid, I could tell something was off with the experience beyond the obvious. It just didn't play as well, and the level design didn't pull me in the way Heroes had. Despite all that though, I still spent a good chunk of time with Shadow and have fond memories of playing with my brother as he tried to be as helpful as possible with the hero partner. I guess at the end of the day, it's a fun memory from my early gaming days. It also presents some ideas I think could be pursued in future Sonic games. I'd love to see a game, for instance, where you create your own character that can choose their path, either fighting side by side with Sonic or joining whatever evil force is threatening the world in that adventure. I think that'd be such a cool idea. I also think just because the open-ended structure of these levels may not have worked doesn't mean I don't want to see the idea approached again in future titles. At the time recording this video, we're still speculating about a game allegedly called Sonic Rangers, which is rumored to be an open world adventure. If that truly is what it's going to be, I hope they look at Shadow and see how just having open space isn't enough. There needs to be an enticing reason to travel through it, and it has to feel more satisfying to actually traverse through the environment. But I give Shadow credit for really trying to deliver that in many places, and it does succeed in some areas. If anything, Shadow the Hedgehog is just an interesting diversion of the franchise. From the grungy aesthetics that every level sports, the rock-heavy soundtrack that sounds more like an extension of Sonic Adventure 2's darkest sounds, to, you know, pretty much everything else I've talked about, it was just a whole ass mood. It's not a game I want to actively return to, but I can't help but enjoy its stupidity. Yeah, please don't try anything like this again, Sonic Team. K, thanks, bye. Sonic 06. Okay, phew, this is going to be fun. Sonic 06 was produced to celebrate the series' 15th anniversary and acted as a soft reboot of the series. Players control Sonic, Shadow, and a new character named Silver who battles Solaris, an ancient evil pursued by Dr. Eggman. Development began in 2004, where Sonic Team sought to advance the series with a realistic tone and multiple gameplay styles. Problems began to arise, however, when Yuji Naka resigned to form his own company, Probe, and the team split to work on Sonic and the Secret Rings. As a result, Sonic the Hedgehog was rushed so it could release in time for the holiday season. Sonic 06 received praise when announced, as people believed it could be the big return to the series' roots after years of mixed reviews, but alas, everything is not what it seems. It has been frequently described as the worst game in the series, and its failure led to the complete shift in the series' direction we're still somewhat seeing the effects of today. So what do big Sonic fans like myself think of Sonic 06 now? I will say playing Sonic 06 side by side with all these other games definitely made its faults as obvious as it has ever been. It is by far the most broken and unpolished game of the 5 here, and also upholds the worst reputation. But I'm a complete idiot, and here's why. Sonic's gameplay here holds the strongest resemblance to the adventure games of the 3, sporting that classic gameplay style that embodies Sonic and Shadow's levels. Upon running through the first level of Sonic though, it's all too clear that Sonic's control just doesn't feel as good this time around. His movement speed is a lot slower first of all, and also takes a good while to set up and use a spin dash, so it is just better to run wherever you need to get to for the most part. I guess his homing attack packs quite a punch, but he also can't just jump into enemies anymore. Yeah, this game has a lot of confusing decisions. I mean, even if Sonic's control isn't the greatest here, it could also be supplemented with good level design. But of course, the game falls in that area too. These levels are probably some of the most linear ones of these games. Multiple pathways are far and few in between with the exception of a few levels. I think the most insulting part of all this though is the excessive amount of automated sections meant to give off the illusion of fast-paced gameplay when in reality, you're just watching a glimpse of what a 3D Sonic cartoon could look like. Not only does Sonic control in a way where it limits what kind of shortcuts you could implement into a level, but there are barely any branching pathways here, and it just makes going through these levels feel like a chore, especially since some of them far overstay their welcome. I will say though, by far the worst part of Sonic's gameplay is definitely the Mach speed sections, or in other words, a very terrible prototype of the boost gameplay. Sonic's control is at its worst here as you struggle to place Sonic in a spot where he won't just fall to his death, especially in some of the later levels. Also, when he jumps, he's not able to move in a different direction mid-air, so you really have to be careful about what angle and position you jump at. It sounds like features that could add some challenge, but it really just makes the experience far more frustrating than it needs to be. There's literally nothing more annoying than collecting hundreds of rings only to lose them all within seconds of starting a Mach speed section. Shadow's gameplay is pretty similar to Sonic's, but it's a bit more focused on combat and the use of vehicles. Yes, they may have tossed out the guns, but the vehicles have returned and actually play a vital role in his gameplay now compared to the more optional approach from prior. Sounds like a great idea. I mean, for the most part, they control okay, just some annoying moments here and there, like when you're piloting this flying saucer looking thingy and you just die cause the camera sucks. But it's pretty annoying that they're required now as they just aren't all that fun to use. As for Shadow himself, I actually think he has a slightly better control than Sonic. He moves at a slower pace, so you're not as likely to suffer from slippery controls. Though there's way more enemies to battle with Shadow, he's also equipped with more moves to compensate for that. I love being able to mash the A button after a homing attack to deliver that devastating blow to larger enemies. It certainly beats just trying to spam the homing attack as Sonic, though when he gets the bounce bracelet it's not as bad. They also incorporate some Shadow special moves like Chaos Spear and Chaos Blast, but honestly these aren't that useful aside from a couple of bosses maybe, but it's nice that they're here. But if there's one thing that I feel drags Shadow's gameplay down, it's of course the level design. It suffers from a lot of the same issues as Sonic's of linearity, but now you also have way more enemies to battle through. As satisfying as it can feel to fight through hordes of them as Shadow, it just gets downright redundant after a while, and I find myself trying to find ways to skip them whenever possible. I honestly don't know why combat was such an emphasized feature in this game. I guess maybe other platforms were edging towards similar focuses around the time, but like, I don't know, it perplexes me. But by far the character of the most combat infused levels is Silver. Yes, back when every Sonic game came with a new character and gameplay style, Silver definitely stands out as one of the most unique gameplay styles to ever appear in a Sonic game. Silver's gameplay revolves around his telekinetic abilities, which allows him to levitate and throw objects at will, resulting in some interesting mechanics exclusive to his playstyle. I would say Silver is probably the least broken of the three, simply because I think through having him move at a slower pace just naturally exposes you less to a lot of the annoying control and camera hiccups the other two have. However, Silver can also have the most redundant and dragged out gameplay for the same reason. Despite his lower speed, he often gets placed in levels about as big as his counterparts, which stinks because he takes twice as long to traverse them. So by default, Silver's levels tend to edge towards the 10-minute mark and over, which I think is just too long for any Sonic level. Not to mention the combat takes a lot longer with Silver, especially if there aren't many objects to actually throw at enemies, because then you need to stun the enemies themselves to get any ammo, and that can be a pain in the ass, especially when you don't have the upgrade that allows you to slam the ground and stun the enemies around you. Silver can certainly be one of the most powerful characters in this game, but it's totally dependent on what's around him. If you don't have a lot to work with, Silver can be a very frustrating character to navigate. I will say though, I do enjoy the idea of Silver's gameplay. It's a cool concept to be able to use your environment to your advantage, and Silver certainly has some cool moments. I think if they just upped his speed and maybe gave him some basic melee attacks like Shadow, he'd be a lot more tolerable. Tropical Jungle, for example, is actually surprisingly fun. I really like being placed in an open environment like that and having to figure out which path to take. There's many different ways you can go about getting to the goal, and it's a really great use of Silver's abilities. Dusty Desert can go die though. Beyond the three, Hedgehogs are also amiibo characters, with 2 embedded into each story. So technically, if we don't count heroes, this game has the most playable characters for an adventure style game. But I think you can tell where this is going to go. Tails is a shell of his former self, as the speed and flight have been severely reduced where it feels like you're flying a boulder. But perhaps the most puzzling aspect of him is the decision to give him ring bombs instead of a more agile spin attack. The ring bombs have a delay before being released, and it honestly feels so sluggish. Knuckles and Rouge are pretty similar here, retaining change the treasure hunting gameplay mechanics, but of course, the control is very stiff and you also should avoid climbing on walls as much as possible. I will say one thing, they gave Rouge a level where she has to find 3 keys, and I actually appreciate the nostalgic influx from that. There was no radar, but the keys were in obvious enough places, so that was nice. Omega shares a lot of similarities to the mech levels, but the lock-on mechanic is gone because now Omega just automatically shoots at enemies, you just have to charge the attack is all. I personally felt the lock-on mechanic was much more interesting than this, but Omega is still admittedly one of the best controlling characters in this game thanks to his hovering ability, which you can totally use to cheat through some levels. The lock-on mechanic though is kinda useless. It takes a few too many seconds to charge up and doesn't even hit the enemies half the time, so I basically just had to walk close to an enemy and just repeatedly click on the X button until they die, and yeah, it's just awkward. By far the best Amigo character here is Blaze. Her gameplay is very similar to Sonic, but she arguably has a slightly better moveset. She has a variation of a double jump and also a spin attack that's very useful in destroying hordes and enemies. She also has a solo level in Wave Ocean, which is undoubtedly the best level in this game. It basically takes the best part of Sonic's version and cuts out the rest of the crap. And it's this level where you really get to appreciate what this game could have been like if it just had some better direction and wasn't all over the place. I've actually returned to this level for many years just for that glimpse into what the game could have been if they had just did things better. But alas, here we are. As for the worst Amigo character, just think of Amy from the original adventure but slower and an even shorter range for a hammer. And apparently Amy swallowed Espio whole because she can turn invisible. Yeah, Amy's terrible. Sonic 06 also has hub worlds that are much larger than original adventures and also just acts as a pretty substantial waste of time meant to just prolong the campaign. Some of the NPCs though are pretty entertaining, I'm not gonna lie.
You don't look like you're that rich.
Probably the most notorious aspect of this game though, besides the gameplay, is the story. Now let me just get this out of the way. I, like many people in the fanbase, am not a fan of the Sonic and Elise relationship. I'm not the kind of person, however, to just bash it because it's a relationship between a hedgehog and a human. We've seen similar relationships in the media but before, and no one bats an eye at those. But what makes this relationship get received so negatively is how utterly forced it feels to the player. Telling a romantic narrative in a game can be very challenging if the time isn't allotted for both necessary and side interactions to really help build the relationship up. In fact, in most games, the relationship is built over many games, not just in one game, and so that's just more things to go against Sonic 06. I'm of the opinion that games like RPGs are the best places to pursue this because you not only have the primary interactions to progress the story, you also have interactions you may or may not invest in during downtime in the game, and these moments often build that relationship in a more natural way, like conversations about your favorite foods, your histories, whatever else people in love talk about. I wouldn't know anything about that. But due to the nature of a Sonic game, their relationship must be built up in a series of cutscenes that are also trying to balance the necessities in progressing the main story. So when you're hit with that first cutscene of Sonic and Elise in the valleys with that bright lighting and special moment, it just feels so forced and out of place because it simply was doomed to fail. But they practically had to do this, I guess, since this happened at the end.
PG-13.
Here's an unpopular opinion though. When Sonic and Elise shared their final interaction, I actually really enjoyed this scene. I know a lot of people look at this and just take away Elise being a whiny annoyance, but what I see here is the fear of losing someone you really grew to appreciate, and that's something anyone can relate to. The build-up may not have been great, but I thought this final moment was very moving. As for Silver's campaign, it's a bit of a mixed bag for me. Let's just not talk about the hot mess that is Blaze's inclusion here. You and I both know that makes no sense and it's just a waste of time to try to make any sense of it. Silver comes off as a young and naive hero who only wants to do what he feels is best to save his home. But I couldn't help but cringe when he just immediately decided to trust this dark hedgehog who doesn't have a mouth. Like, I know you're desperate, but yeah, how does he not come off as suspicious? I guess I can accept it for what it is, since the only world Silver's ever known is the one plagued with destruction and loss due to Iblis. Why wouldn't you jump at the first chance of putting an end to that? Still, he feels a bit annoying due to his immaturity, but at the same time he has a more relatable aura about him that I've always appreciated. I like how he looks up to Blaze for guidance when it comes to some more complex scenarios, for instance. Silver also has a lot of heart, and that's why despite debuting in the worst game possible, he still managed to grow a significant fanbase within the Sonic community. I really enjoyed how even with everything going on, he still decided to help Amy with her seemingly worthless mission to chase after Sonic, and remember that Amy is a complete stranger to Silver. He's obviously a good guy. So I really do hope Silver gets another shot at a starring role one day and actually gets a quality campaign he deserves. Now when it comes to Shadow's story, what we have here is the best part of the narrative of Sonic Sonic 06. Shadow's campaign revolves around pursuing Metropolis, who is practically the main villain of the game, so in a sense, this game is closer to Shadow the Hedgehog 2 than you may think. But what I enjoyed so much about Shadow's campaign is how it feels like a great successor to the events in his life up to that point. Here you have a literal shadow of your former self touting revenge and cruelty in response to the way you are treated, and in the past, Shadow very much gave into these feelings, which resulted in the entirety of Sonic Adventure 2. But to see Shadow immediately defy that once Metropolis proposes it is a great sign of growth and development and actual continuity within the Sonic franchise, who even was Sega back then. I also feel like Shadow's story made great use of Rouge and Omega, consistently showing them throughout the entire story and really having them intertwine well with the main plot. There's even a shred of conflict between them when Omega reveals how he is involved in Shadow ultimately being captured. It's heartbreaking but really good storytelling. Meanwhile, in Sonic's story, Tails and Knuckles just feel like props to fill in the gaps when Elise isn't there, which I guess was their intention since they wanted to focus on that relationship. It sucks, but not gonna lie, it kinda be hilarious to have Tails and Knuckles just in the background during scenes like this.
He knows the way to a woman's heart.
But back to Shadow, I think due to his very nature, he just naturally fits well into the tone Sonic team were going for with Sonic 06, and it shows. I am so utterly conflicted with Sonic 06. Even right now as I'm writing this video, I find I have the urge to continue going back to the game and get closer to 100%. Like, I know the game is flawed, I know it's broken, I know that it's just basically a hot mess, but like, I think it just proves how much I've missed the adventure formula and how Sonic 06 really tried to bring that experience into the next generation at the time. Yes, the game is poorly made and is a tragic representation of how Sega ran their company around the time, but I still see the sparks of potential and great ideas embedded in here, and how this game would have truly been the Sonic Adventure 3 we wanted if given the right direction and much more time. But even in its current state, I think I love this game. No matter how many times I bang my head on the table, that opinion doesn't change. I guess I know why I'm talking to my therapist about this week. Sonic Adventure 2 was the final Sonic game for the Dreamcast after Sega left the home console market. It features two good vs evil stories, Sonic, Tails and Knuckles vs Shadow, Eggman and Rouge. The stories are divided into three gameplay styles: classic fast-paced platforming for Sonic and Shadow, mech shooting for Tails and Eggman, and treasure hunting for Knuckles and Rouge. Development began soon after the American release of Sonic Adventure in 1999 and lasted about 18 months, with its locations being influenced by American ones like San Francisco and Yosemite National Park. Together, the Dreamcast and GameCube versions sold more than 2 million copies worldwide. The game also received generally positive reviews for its gameplay variety, visuals, and audio, though some criticized its camera, voice acting, and plot. Having never owned a Dreamcast, the battle version for the GameCube was my primary experience with the game. This game was the reason I wanted a GameCube actually. My dad thought I'd be satisfied with the Xbox, but that of course went out the window as a new Sonic fan when one of its allegedly best games was exclusive to the GameCube. Man, I just remember opening up my new GameCube frantically just so I could get my hands on this game. Unlike Sonic Adventure, I had no way of trying out this game beforehand, so this was going to be my very first time playing through Adventure 2. Much like most Sonic games now that I think about it, my opinion on Adventure 2 has definitely been a roller coaster ride. For a long while, I considered it to be right behind Sonic Heroes in my list of favorite Sonic games. It seemingly had everything you could ever want in a big 3D Sonic adventure: fast-paced gameplay, an epic story, a child garden that's improved in every way imaginable, and so much more. But as the years have passed, I've been a lot more confused about my opinion on this game. I decided to talk about Adventure 2 last, as I feel it's a perfect summation of many points I brought up with these games, so here we go. Obviously, the main attraction for anyone new to the game is the fast-paced platforming with Sonic and Shadow. At first glance, it seems to borrow heavily from the original Adventure. You control Sonic in a 3D space with the goal of moving through the level quickly. One of the first main differences here though is the incorporation of a ranking system, which most Sonic platformers afterwards would keep. This incentivizes you to not only finish the level fast, but to also optimize your route to attain the most points while doing so. From pulling off tricks from ramps, chaining enemies together, and more, it encourages a different kind of exploration that I really dig. I also think it's the most balanced ranking system of the games here. I feel like Heroes and Shadow gave you A ranks very easily, while 06's level design can just make them a chore to achieve. But Adventure 2 is graded pretty fairly. It's not impossible to get these A ranks, but it will challenge you, and even for someone like me who's played this game forever, I often won't get an A rank on my first try with most levels. Another thing about this game's levels that make it stand out from the first game is the fact that they tend to be more linear. You don't have as many chances to branch off off into a different path, which can definitely seem like a negative. However, the levels here are still very fun because it's much more dependent on optimizing the main path to score the most points in the least amount of time. Take Pyramid Cave for instance. You have these long stretches where you just run down a cave, but then there's these hoops you can jump through to earn points. Depending on how ambitious you are, you can go for some of the harder to reach ones to increase your score. This is a different approach from the original adventure, as exploration is much more driven by the ranking system, which is a nice change of pace. I think I ultimately prefer how the original adventure plays, but Adventure 2's levels are still quite fun and it does a lot that I wish the future adventure style games did, since they contain many more linear-ish levels as well that don't employ the same design philosophies. Sonic and Shadow overall control pretty well, and they definitely optimize some of their moves, like how the light dash is done with the press of a button now rather than having to hold and charge it. Spin dash has been nerfed though to where you must charge it and then release to utilize it, unlike in the original adventure where you could just spam it rapidly. I think I have to give my preference to the original adventure, as I think there was just something so much fun about utilizing the spin dash to discover new pathways and secrets, where Adventure 2's spin dash is still pretty effective and fun to use. I guess putting it all together, I do prefer the platforming of the original adventure, but Adventure 2 is certainly nothing to scoff at and it's definitely fun in its own ways. I guess you could say there's a reason to indulge in both, which is cool. Now for the other gameplay styles are where my opinion on this game has definitely varied over the years. The mech shooting levels honestly used to be my least favorite part of the game. Don't get me wrong, even as a kid I had a small appreciation for Gamma's gameplay. It was solidly built and fun enough in the original adventure, but to see Tails stuff into one of these things felt so disappointing to me, and that ultimately did cloud a lot of my judgment on these levels. But now that I'm older and can actually look past that stuff, I actually have to admit that the mech levels here are a vast improvement over Gamma's levels. The lockout mechanic feels just as solid as the first games, but now thanks to the ranking system, it feels so much more satisfying linking together chains of enemies, as it just makes your score grow insanely fast. Compared to the timer mechanic they had in the first game when you were never really in danger of running out of time unless you got lost like really easily. But what really helps these levels stand out from Gamma's is the more challenging and innovative level design. There's just generally more interesting things going on in Adventure 2's levels, along with a more reasonable length that makes each level feel like an actual level. I think Tails' levels are stuffed with a few too many enemies for some reason, but Eggman's levels are perfectly balanced and contain some of the game's best moments. The only thing I can truly criticize about the mech shooting levels is that Tails and Eggman can feel pretty clunky and heavy to control, which is definitely in contrast to the lighter feel of Gamma. It's fine I guess, but it just feels like it limits you more, which is unfortunate. But overall, I definitely prefer how they did mech shooting here. It's fun, challenging, and well designed. I probably would have preferred a split where we saw more speed levels and less of these, but for what it's worth, it still contributes to the quality of the game. Now, for gameplay style I really had trouble wrapping my head around. Treasure hunting was definitely a big question mark for me for the longest time. I went through phases where I thought this was my least favorite gameplay style as well. Treasure hunting here retains all the elements from the original, but basically expands the levels you're playing to much greater lengths. I mean, this is exactly what I criticized the first Adventures levels for. The levels there, while fun to explore, usually lasted only a couple minutes due to how small the areas were, thus making the emerald pieces pretty easy to find. But you're definitely not going to find that same ease here. Though the first levels are still pretty easy to navigate, the game pumps up the difficulty greatly by the end, and it definitely gives you a lot more to explore, which sounds great. But they also made the levels more annoying as well. Probably the most dumbfounded decision with these levels is what they did to the radar system. Instead of reasonably sensing any of the Dream Master Emerald pieces, it will only sense one at a time, even if you are right next to one that isn't being focused on. This was such a ridiculous change for me. Like, the amount of times I actually ran around looking for a piece only to find one the radar didn't pick up on was just really funny to me. This isn't such a big deal in the smaller levels, but when you get to the likes of Meteor Herd and Mad Space, that's when this change really shows its downsides and drags the gameplay down. Depending on the emerald piece, I could spend 10 to 20 minutes in these levels due to this radar system, and it just wears on you after a while. It's a shame because basically everything else about these levels are a vast improvement over the original. Knuckles has never felt better to control, and the environments actually suit his abilities, being made exclusively for him and Rouge. I overall prefer Adventure 2's treasure hunting levels, as it may have lower lows, but it has highs that far outpeak the original game, and that's enough for me to give these levels the win. I'd just much rather replay levels like Pumpkin Hill than Mad Space, especially with the boat system of the latter one. So overall, the gameplay for Adventure 2 is actually pretty solid. I definitely went through phases of not enjoying the mech shooting or treasure hunting levels as much, as there is always going to be a part of me that wishes these games had exclusively focused on Sonic and Shadow's gameplay, but all things considered, they are still a real fun time on their own, and I'm ultimately happy they made the cut here. One thing to mention here is that Adventure 2 does get rid of the hub worlds in an effort to get you from stage to stage more instantaneously, which I guess is a positive or negative depending on who you ask. I didn't mind this change, but I won't lie, I like the adventure fields of the original and would have liked to have been able to explore some Adventure 2, but it's not a deal breaker. Something that may turn off people, however, is that instead of separate campaigns for each character, 3 characters are tied to a single campaign. As As a result, you often go from speed level to mech level to treasure hunting level to mech level and even an oddball kart racer level in each campaign. Whether or not you like this change entirely depends on your opinion on the multiple gameplay styles, so for me, it's totally fine as I did enjoy all three and like how it keeps the game feel refreshing. But if you dislike one or two of them, you'll always be upset you have to play it, especially after playing a level that you liked. I think I ultimately prefer how the original adventure does it, as I probably would have really disliked going from Sonic and Twinkle Park to Amy and her version of the level, but it doesn't bother me as much in Adventure 2 due to how well designed I feel all three gameplay styles are. What really ties Adventure 2 together though is, well, everything else. Sonic Adventure 2 just feels like a really cool game, as shallow as that probably sounds. I remember booting up the game for the first time being hit with that iconic intro cutscene. After witnessing some pretty badass poses from the cast and that electrifying guitar riff from Junsen Yu, seeing Sonic and Shadow cross paths and the game's logo pop up just tells you exactly how slick this game is going to be. Sonic Adventure 2 has my favorite soundtrack in the entire series. It's much more predominantly rock than the other soundtracks, which I know probably turns off a good portion of the fan base, but I think it really suits the tone of this game. It's about that delicate balance between good and evil we all need to grapple with in the world, and the music just perfectly captures that tension the game is conveying constantly. And there is still some slight diversity in the music, but instead of it being attached to each level, it's more so a style assigned to each character. Sonic has high-speed, positive-sounding rock music, while Tails shares a similar sound that's a little slower pace. Knuckles' iconic hip-hop sounds return here with multiple vocal themes for you to enjoy. Shadow sports upbeat music with a slight electronic influence and a more sinister sound. Eggman sports that rock theme used throughout the game, but with it sounding more sinister as well. And Rouge has very jazzy, sexy sounding music that I'm just in love with. I really do like how the music is designed around the characters in this game. Not many other Sonic games do this as far as I remember, and it's a unique way to develop the personalities of these characters. But a spot in this game that really shines to bring all this together is the story. With the story being divided into just two narratives, I feel this made it easier for the team to tell a story that had less filler and was thus much more focused and refined. The hero story is pretty typical fanfare for Sonic. It has a weird start with Sonic being captured by GUN and all, but it quickly reverts to that classic plot of putting a stop to Dr. Eggman's plans. I'll admit, the story is sorta lacking here in terms of character development compared to the original adventure, but I categorize this story to be much more action oriented, pulling you from one situation to the next. I'd say it suits this game pretty well. We do have a somewhat powerful scene though where Sonic allegedly falls to his doom and Tails finds the courage to fight through his heartache. Just another example of how well written Tails was in these games. Unfortunately, Amy has quite the opposite treatment. She really was done dirty in the story, I'm not gonna lie. The meat of the story really shows up in the dark story, however, where you get to explore the perspective of Eggman mapping out his plans for the first time. It's such a cool idea that I'm surprised not many other games have tackled, at least to this extent. Eggman's always been that antagonist that's just there to be the bad guy, and well, he pretty much lives up to that here. But it's cool nonetheless to see how he plans what he does and carries it out. However, I think Shadow and Rouge are the true highlights of the story. Rouge is an extremely entertaining character to watch in this game. She always seems to know just what to say to get you to smile even during some pretty tense moments, and she's also just very fun to see interact with Knuckles. Yes, I ship them, deal with it. Shadow on the other hand, what can I say about him at this point? This game is the reason so many people became longtime fans of Shadow all the way up to this very moment. The whole reason Shadow the Hedgehog was able to exist in the way it did was because Sonic Adventure 2 had the perfect amount of development yet mystery surrounding this character. One of the first moments you get to see a little bit into Shadow's intentions is during the scene before Radical Highway. It's short and sweet but really effective in establishing that he is somewhat tortured and has a lot of built up anger within him. Throughout the game though, you really only get snippets into Shadow's psyche due to the game's fast-paced, action-oriented tone, but it leaves just enough there to warrant further exploration in future titles. When the whole game comes together in the last story and we see Shadow have that last-minute shift in perspective, it was one of the most beautiful things to me as a kid to witness. And man, that last cutscene where you literally have Tails and Eggman sharing this weird moment was just awesome and something only this game could have provided us. I legitimately think that while the gameplay is so fun and solid to me, the story just perfectly ties this game together and helps craft the best adventures Sonic has ever undergone. Sonic Adventure 2 feels like a franchise-defining moment in Sonic's history. There's literally no other game that has been able to match its intensity and sense of adventure except maybe the original Adventure and Unleash. But there's a reason so many games afterwards would constantly reference events of this game, especially Shadow's development. This game left a huge impact that many games afterwards would try to replicate, and while many of them would do good jobs on their own, Sonic Adventure 2 just feels like an event that cannot be recreated. I think I'm finally ready to do it. I'm ready to officially declare Sonic Adventure 2 as my favorite Sonic game of all time. It took me some time in particular to deduce my opinion on the alternate gameplay styles, but I ultimately love every minute of this game and wouldn't change it for the world. One thing about adventure games I struggle to have an opinion on is if it's defined by whether or not you have multiple gameplay styles. The first two adventure games made this an integral part of the campaign, and it also helped to solidify that scope of adventure by giving you all these perspectives on the game's events and thus witnessing the impact the story's events have on the whole world. And I have to admit, that's something I just don't get with more recent Sonic games where he's the only playable character. While I openly admit to enjoying some of these alternate playstyles quite a bit, I also think the concept itself is flawed by today's standards. It can be such an immersion breaker to go from playing a really fun level as Sonic to a slower, clunkier experience as Tails in his mech suit. Sure, I may enjoy these levels, but not everyone is going to. So I ultimately think if they want to return to an adventure style game, you can't bring back gameplay styles like mech shooting and intertwine them with the main campaign. However, I'm totally not at all against the idea of multiple characters. In fact, that's something I truly miss seeing in modern Sonic games. I think the best way to approach them is how they approach Tails in the original adventure or Blaze in Sonic 06. Have the characters share the main or similar objective as Sonic, but give them their own abilities to vary up the gameplay, a lot like how Sonic Mania incorporated Mighty and Ray into the main game. I think with that in mind, you can keep the multiple storylines and perspectives the original adventure games had. The actual gameplay just won't be as diverse, which I feel just offers a better, more consistent gameplay experience. I won't lie though, I'd love to see something like treasure hunting get expanded upon, whether it be an optional campaign in a mainline title or even be given its own spin-off title. You could do so much of a Knuckles game that is not Knuckles Chaotix. Same thing with Silver, his gameplay doesn't belong in a Sonic game, but man, to see that be expanded into a brand new spin-off title could be a ton of fun if done correctly. Just saying. But otherwise, the adventure era games were just such an amazing time to get into the franchise. I hold these games so close to my heart as they not only introduced me to the world of Sonic, but also to the possibilities of video games overall. Being able to take control of an agile character like Sonic that can reach all these different places with secrets and goodies helped me to really fall in love with the platformer genre. And I'll always have these games to thank for that, despite the flaws that they all sport retrospectively, because yeah, there are quite a few flaws in these games, even the best ones. My view of these games will forever be clouded with nostalgia and love, but I'm still looking forward to whatever Sega decides to pump out next, as new experiences can be just as valuable as old ones. I feel like even if Sega did go back to the adventure formula, it would never live up to these memories to me, and that's perfectly okay. I know there's a ton of fans out there like me that crave these experiences, that want this gameplay style to return, but I really would try to give what's next a chance as well. We shouldn't be looking towards new stuff wanting more of what had come before just because they gave us good memories before. We can love and cherish the past all we want, but when that gets in the way of appreciating what's coming out now, that's when I feel like video games cannot please the consumer anymore. I can hold Adventure 2 to my heart and claim it's the best experience video games will ever offer, but I can still play Sonic Generations and have an absolute blast playing through what Sega envisions for this franchise nowadays. Everything is fine and balanced with an open mind, and to me, that's the key to really enjoying the adventure we call video games. Thank you so much for watching this video. Special shout out to my patrons, Team Rattle Sonic Gamer, Johnny Hinton Ortiz, Trash Q, Claw84. These are my patrons / YouTube members. If you'd like to become a patron or YouTube member and get access to a whole bunch of different perks, then please check out the links in the description box below. But alright, this is Riders, riding out.